Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the hearing of the Mana Whenua section or proposed of the proposed district plan. And I'd like to welcome everybody here. Thank you for your involvement and your input into the plan. We have read the Mana Whenua section and Courtney your 42A report, and there'll be some questions that will arise out of that, and thank you for your legal opinion, Michael. Would you like to take us initially through your 42A report just as an overview? I don't expect that you'll take us through page by page, but just to give us an overview to set the scene. Thank you.
Well, kia ora koutou. Good morning, Michael Garbutt, Councillor for the Council. I just wanted to update you. You may have picked up perhaps on Friday and this morning, Mr. Leckie and I have had a few discussions over a policy that I raised in my legal submissions, and he has responded to that on behalf of the Rūnaka and tabled late on Friday, which hopefully has found its way to you, an updated wording of the policy. This is a SASM policy, and I just wanted to alert you that that's been studied and appreciated, and it does overcome the legal concerns that are raised in my legal submissions. So the redraft that Mr. Leckie will probably take you through, I just wanted you to be aware from the legal point of view on behalf of the Council is acceptable, and so that overcomes that concern. We realised this morning it's actually a policy that goes into the SASM chapter rather than the Mana Whenua chapter, but it was raised in the context of Mana Whenua, so we wanted to discuss it today, but it's probably one that you should look at, and if you're happy with it, park it, and it will slot in when we get to the SASM provisions in due course. So I just wanted to raise that with you so that you're aware of what's been going on in the background.
There is an alternative, isn't there, that would probably be equally agreeable and probably worth flagging now, and that is, rather than having a provision actually written into the plan, there is the opportunity of a recommendation from this panel as part of issuing the decisions back to Council, so the decision then lies with Council to consider. So it then becomes a decision of the Council rather than a decision of the panel.
Yes, it is, Commissioner, and that was one of the issues I did raise in my legal submissions. That there's a range of ways to solve the problem. I raised what I saw as a legal problem, and I provided a range of solutions. It's probably not exhaustive, but one of those, yes, was to recommend back to the Council. I'm sure Mr. Leckie and Mana Whenua may have a view about that, and I did discuss that with him, and I'm well aware that they have a reasonably strong view that, at least in the plan, it provides transparency, it's open, and we don't have to negotiate anything. It's there for all to see. And if the form of it is acceptable, I think he would submit to you that why should it not be in the plan? That's the right place for it. And I don't argue with that. It's ultimately for the panel in terms of the merits of whether this is an appropriate thing to be doing. Legally, I say in the form that it's been amended, I'm satisfied it's not creating legal problems for the Council, so we've overcome my concern. Then it goes to whether the wording is appropriate for you, and whether you wish to either decide it goes in the plan or perhaps recommend it goes back to the Council. So that's all I want to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Over to you, Courtney.
Tēnā koutou. So I'm Courtney Bennett, appearing on behalf of the Council in a planning role. I'll very, very quickly take you through section 42A, but then I'll focus more on my supplementary evidence, because I know that's come through quite recently. So as you'll be aware, There were 26 submissions and 7 further submissions on the Mana Whenua chapter. Most of them had a range of issues, particularly around the way that sites and areas of significance to Māori were managed within the plan. As a result of submissions, range of recommended changes have been made, minor wording changes to reflect a more nuanced description of the potential environmental impacts of primary production activities, minor amendments across multiple PDP chapters to clarify matters relating to Ngaitahu cultural values, removal of references to sites of cultural significance, and rewording of the PDP definition of mahinga kai within the interpretation section. Going over to my supplementary evidence. So there was evidence received from Federated Farmers and a suite of evidence from Hokonui Runanga. In terms of the Federated Farmers evidence, I acknowledge what was received by them. I highlight, similar to they do, that most of their matters actually relate to the SASM chapter, and I agree that they need to be thoroughly looked through, but in that hearing. I also note that they were interested in some discussion, some conferencing around the way SASM was addressed in the plan. I have no view either way on whether or not conferencing should happen. That's a matter for you as the panel, but I'm happy to make myself available for that if that's something that you direct. Going over to the Hokonui Runanga evidence, I acknowledge the evidence of Ms Nichols, Ms Brand and Ms Kane, and Ms Barron as well, of course. Ms Barron's evidence looked at matters to do with sites and areas of significance to Māori, plan variation, Ngaitahu values, Mana Whenua chapter, general rural zone, rural, and some of the rural zones. Those rural matters will be addressed by my colleague, and I'll look at the rest of them. So Ms Barron and I had some informal conferencing to discuss some agreed wording and agreed positions on a range of matters. We were able to agree on wording for a wide range of those matters, and they are in Appendix 1 of my supplementary evidence. As part of our discussions, my position on some matters have changed. So initially in my section 42A, I was opposed to the use of the term waihi tapu throughout the plan on the basis that there were no specific locations listed as waihi tapu within the plan. After our discussion, I now understand that Hokonui Runanga want to use the term waihi tapu as a concept as opposed to specific locations. And based on that understanding, I support the use of it, provided that that explanation of how the term is used gets put into the Mana Whenua chapter so that it's clear for everybody.
Can we just stop there for one?
Yes.
Catch up. Yeah, it's likely to be a pattern today.
That's cool.
I'm just going to pause and note that in terms of access to the supplementary evidence, I need to check where, because I know that you've got hard copies for the remainder of the panel, but I just need to be able to access it electronically.
You haven't got it? Is it online?
Or does he email it through to?
Looking in today, is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Looking in today, is that what you're asking?
So what I've recorded here is that with regard to waihi tapu, you see it as appropriate to include it in the plan as a concept rather than identifying specific sites.
That's, from my understanding, that's the desire of Hokonui Runanga, and I don't see a problem with that.
Okay.
Yep.
Courtney, I've got a...
Oh, I'm,
Yeah, no, she hasn't.
yeah. Just let me know when you guys are.
Yeah, yeah. So you're also going to talk about waihi, no?
No, the next thing on my list was about the SASM policy. So as has been discussed, there's been this SASM policy that's been under discussion. As I said in my supplementary evidence, Ms Beran and I agree in principle that a work program would be useful for clarifying and providing more data to help with those discussions. Whether or not a specific policy is used or another method, I have no specific position on what would be most useful. I defer to our legal counsel on those matters. Another matter that was raised in Ms Beran's evidence was adding some extra wording around the links to Ngāi Tahu cultural values, particularly in rules and matters of discretion. So at the moment, the wording talks about Ngāi Tahu cultural values as identified in Mana Whenua 2.3. Ms Beran's evidence requests that that's expanded to say as identified in Mana Whenua 2.3 and the objectives and policies of the chapter. I agree in principle with that, but to further strengthen that again, I've recommended that we add to that a reference to the SASM chapter as well, so it would read Ngāi Tahu cultural values as identified in Mana Whenua 2.3 and the objectives and policies of this chapter and the SASM chapter, just to make everything really clear where everybody needs to go in those matters. And a full list of all of the proposed amendments that are additional to those in the section 42A are in my supplementary evidence in appendixes 1 and 2. But most of those changes just relate to minor wording changes, either to reintroduce the term waihi tapu where Hokonui Runanga deem that appropriate, and to strengthen that wording around where to find information about Ngāi Tahu cultural values to make the plan more transparent and user-friendly. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Courtney. I just want a wee bit of clarity about the inclusion or reference to, and please correct me on my pronunciation, Apiti Hono Tai Tai Hono.
Yep,
and
Apiti
that,
Hono Tātai Hono, yep.
yes. Could you repeat that for me?
Apiti Hono Tātai Hono.
Thank you, Courtney. Now that appears to be ongoing work on a regional basis, and it's the foundation for a potential variation at some point. Firstly, how's that wider discussion? Are you aware how that's proceeding? And could you give me some clarity around what that might do? I see that it's Ngāi Tahu worldview. Is that correct in my understanding of what that description is?
Ms Kane is most appropriate to discuss that more fully. That's what the majority of her evidence is based on, so she's very well placed to speak on that, and so would be Ms Beran to talk about from Hokonui perspective, and particularly also Ms Brand as well, because that's work that the Runanga is involved in. My understanding in this role with the council is that it's an ongoing piece of work. It's something that both parties are committed to exploring. And I note that in Ms Kane's evidence, she talks about the fact that it needs to, the Gorda Strip plan is the first plan in Murihaku that's attempting to implement this, so it needs to be carefully considered how that's done.
Would you like to elaborate, please, or add to?
Come back later.
No, possibly we'll do that later.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ms Kane will be very well placed to speak on that.
We will
Thank you.
be looking to you though as the advisor to council,
Yep.
to give us your view on the way that potentially is implemented. But we'll come back to that later.
I'm happy to speak on it from an implementation perspective, but in the discussion about what it is and how it works from that technical perspective, that's a bit outside my scope.
I've got no other questions at this stage for Courtney. Are there other questions?
I've got questions. I'd want to start actually picking up a legal question. It may or may not be a legal question. You might bat it back to Ms Bennett. But I'm wondering if we should be differentiating between parts of the plan that deal with Section 6E matters and 8 and 7A more broadly, and those that are specific to Section 6F. And think about, my reason for asking that question is thinking about the function of the Mana Whenua chapter and the function of the Sazen chapter. But just from a legal standpoint, we have two matters of national importance that are differentiated. I'd be interested in some guidance from you on that thought.
It's actually quite a difficult question to answer, but I'll provide my answer from the legal perspective, and perhaps Ms Bennett might also. It's my view Section 6E and 6F are probably overlapping in the sense that, as I've recorded in my submissions, historic heritage is defined as including quite a long list of matters, one of which includes sites and significance to Māori, including cultural values and wāhi tapu, and that probably, in my view, does overlap with Section 6E. Whether there's a clear differentiation between 6E and 6F as it relates to values of importance to Māori, I have my doubts. The Runaka may have a different view, but I don't think it will be easy or clear to clearly differentiate between those two matters. And then whether you can differentiate between Sections 6, matters of national importance, and Section 7A and Section 8, issues relating to kaitiakitanga or taking into account the principle of the treaty. Again, they are probably overlapping. I do think if it were possible in the plan to identify that this provision addresses Section 6E or 6F or 8, clearly that would be desirable, but I actually think that's probably illusory and you may struggle to achieve that. I haven't seen a plan that specifically says a policy is designed specifically to address one piece of the Act.
So I'm just going to tease that out a little. So because we do have a historic heritage chapter and the option for a sites and areas of significance to Māori chapter, and these are in the National Planning Standards, differentiated from the Mana Whenua chapter, and that looking at historic heritage and Sazen, there's a very clear link to that RMA definition.
Yes.
I guess this is something that I appreciate your answer, and I'm just going to keep sort of teasing out as we go through the day. Thinking about, the functions of these different parts of the plan and what they're addressing. So on that, thank you for that. That theme, I'm going to come across to you, Ms Bennett, and kia ora. For the room, we have worked together in the past, so acknowledging. And I have sort of some overarching questions, perhaps before we get into a paragraph by paragraph look through your Section 42A. One thing that I wanted to ask from the outset is, do you think that some of the submissions that have targeted concerns around the SESM in the whole of the district being of significance is perhaps related to the structure that's been chosen. And so my reason for asking that is because I've been wondering why the Mana Whenua chapter itself has no provisions, doesn't have objectives or policies that might pick up the broader picture. And it does seem that the reaction has a lot been to do with what people imagine a SESM chapter to be doing. So just on that basic idea of thinking about the structure of the plan and where provisions are sitting, could part of the resolution for the concerns coming through submissions relate to where provisions sit, whether they're in the Mana Whenua or the SESM? So just an initial foray.
I think it's important to recognise that the National Planning Standards very tightly restrict what we can have in the Mana Whenua chapter. From my understanding, the Mana Whenua chapter is directed to focus on explanatory text as opposed to having its own objectives, policies and rules framework. For that, that's the main reason that there aren't any in that chapter. So whether having policy in that chapter would alleviate it becomes a bit of a moot point because we're not allowed.
So that's actually one of my questions from at your paragraph 17 of your section 42A, where you're pointing to the National Planning Standards, and I thought that's what I was picking up in, but when I look at direction 26 of the National Planning Standards, it seems to suggest that local authorities may include provisions relating to the matters in direction 28, and reading that, it made me think that there might be some potential there to
And to take that further, the SASM chapter is a discretionary chapter in the plan under the standards. So for those councils that don't have them, where do the objectives and policies sit? My reading of the National Planning Standards is that it's mandatory to include things. It is discretionary to include more in that chapter if it isn't elsewhere in the plan. And particularly taking into account the recommendation or the agreement that you've reached, or your view is corresponds to the Hokanui Brunanga, that specific sites won't be shown. To me, it actually brings doubt that we actually need the SASM chapter in the plan at all if there are no sites to be identified. So why can't the two chapters be brought together?
I wouldn't share that view. If we do not have a policy framework to deal with sites and areas of significance and the Ngaitai relationship with their takiwa, then it's not covered anywhere in the plan. And
sorry to interrupt, you may have picked up my question wrong. You take the provisions out, the objectives and policies out of the SASM chapter and put them in the Mana Whenua chapter. So from a coordination point of view, everything is sitting there together. So my question is, why do we need to have a separate chapter that deals with SASM when the provisions, because it's discretionary, can be included in the Mana Whenua chapter?
I have two perspectives on that, and it is a good question from both of you. First of all, I'd be interested in our legal counsel's perspective on what the National Planning Standards direct in that area, because my understanding was that, based on my reading of the National Planning Standards, that it's not a place for policies, objectives and rules. But further to that, the purpose of those two chapters is quite different. The Mana Whenua chapter really is an explanatory chapter. It's a place for a range of information on matters such as who to contact and how to contact your relevant Mana Whenua groups, what these concepts of importance are to those groups, a lot of that kind of information, which is fundamentally different from policy direction. Yeah, so my perspective is that the two play quite a different role functionally. To pull the two together could create, one, a very long chapter, but also a chapter with two quite different purposes. But that, yeah, I'd also be interested on what our legal counsel has to say about what we can and can't do under the National Planning Standards. I think it's also important to highlight that the matters around SASM and its approach in the plan are mentioned in the Mana Whenua chapter in, I think, one line as an example of how the council and Mana Whenua have worked together in the plan. It's just one small part of that wider chapter, and because of the range of views that the community hold on that matter, which are all valid and worthy of being looked through, they've attached those concerns to the Mana Whenua chapter instead of the SASM chapter, where those matters more sensibly sit in this process.
And I guess while Mr. Garbutt is looking up the standards to give us a response, do you see a difference between sites of significance to Maori and land of importance to Maori? Because and the reason for asking it is that if the intent is not to identify specific sites, to me what's being described is the district, the land is of importance, but sites of significance aren't being identified, other than the sites that are identified in the heritage chapter. So the Tukarau Reserve, Fine Spot, the battle site are all identified in the heritage chapter as having heritage value, but with not identifying sites of significance. To me, it's land of importance to the Runanga that is being described. So do you see a difference between the two? Sites of significance versus land of importance?
My initial perspective on that, apart from that being something that is more sensibly spoken about by Mana Whenua, but from my perspective as a technical planner, the term sites near significance to Māori is only really used because that's what's in our policy, like at national level. That's the reason we use that term. It's not a term that comes from Te Ao Māori. It's a term that comes from the planning world. If you're looking at the semantics of it, sites and land, I don't see much difference. I do think it's important to refer back to Ms. Brand's evidence, where she very clearly says that, and Ms. Kane's evidence, that the reason that specific locations aren't identified is because you would be literally identifying every single part of the district, which is a waste of everyone's time, really. So you either say, we're not listing anything because everywhere's important, or you say, okay, let's list every parcel of land and every water body in the district.
I guess I'll add it to the list that Mr. Garbutt needs to address us on. And about 15 years ago, there was a case in Queenstown when the review of the plan was going through, might be a little bit longer than that now, where, with regard to the chapter on landscapes of significance, the council's decision on submission said the whole district is of significance from a landscape point of view, to which Judge Jackson said that is not what the Act requires. It requires identification, and given that it's discretionary, I think we've got to be careful how we use the terms. So you picked up your Michael, in terms of the standards?
I'm just looking through it.
Yeah, it's not where you'd expect to find it. You want us to come back to it?
Yeah, you carry on with your questions.
So I'm going to leave that Sesam mana whenua question for a moment and check some basics. So thinking about when I was reading the glossary, which is part of this hearing, I was wondering about macrons and I was wondering about the process for just making sure that we've got all of that text right in relation to macrons. The one that I was wondering about was ara tawhito. I think I've quite often used a macron in that one and it's not there in the glossary, and I thought perhaps I am wrong, but one way or another it was just a basic thought around knowing that we are putting a plan out in the world that is as accurate as it can be.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And the other thing on the ara tawhito, when I read that in the glossary and then I read Ms. Brand's evidence, and it was coming through somewhere else as well, this idea that the ara tawhito are not just the walking trails, you know, they're including the waterways. So I wondered if, just as a matter of accuracy, we should be reflecting on these as sort of transport routes or all the modes that might. So I think that's a small thing and a simple thing, but something that I noted. MW5 is talking about the two charters, and I went and had a look at both, and it did make me wonder what the role of that charter between Hokonui and Gore, what role does that have in our considerations through this process, if any?
In terms of the ara tawhito, based on the dictionary that I've used, tawhito doesn't have a macron on it. But if that is different regionally, that's something we can look into, and that's something that we can seek advice on, I'm sure. The second part of that question was around the charters. My understanding is that those two documents set down a framework for ensuring that there is appropriate process and resourcing for Hokonui Runanga to provide that that technical assistance to council in making decisions around Ngāi Tahu cultural values. Personally, I don't see seeking experted input on those matters as any different to seeking expert engineering advice or hydrology advice. So yeah, those two documents set down a framework around that resourcing to make sure that there is a clear process there to be able to get things done in a transparent and efficient way.
Does that have a relationship then to implementation of the plan and the provisions, where we land on those?
In some ways, my perspective is that once the provisions in the plan are set down, it's for the council and Runanga to make sure there's a process there to make that happen. If there is a concern that a process can't be set down, that's something that I would expect the Runanga to be able to highlight, that there's a policy position that might be difficult to implement on their end. They haven't highlighted that. And having that service level agreement also shows that there's a process to be able to, or at least a willingness to resource that in some way. But I would be reticent to try and talk about the ability Runanga have to do things, because that's not for us to talk about.
Perhaps before you move on to another topic, I can address that issue now about mandatory or discretionary.
Please
if that's
do.
helpful. Thank you. So I've just dived back into the National Planning Standards, and if you make a note of the following, so Chapter 4 of the National Planning Standards sets out the mandatory district plan structure. Clause 4.2 says that those chapters and sections in black must be included in the order shown, and that does include in black below the chapter of Tangata Whenua Mana Whenua, so that is a mandatory chapter. It goes on in clause 4.3 to say, unless otherwise specified, chapters and sections shown in grey in table 4 must be included if relevant to the district in the order shown. And when I go down to table 4, the chapter of sites and significance to Māori appears in grey under the heading historical and cultural values. So what basically that means in simple terms is that sites and significance to Māori is mandatory if it's relevant to the district. And so I don't agree that the sites and significance to Māori is purely discretionary. If there are such values in the district, it must be included in the order shown in the National Planning Standard. So that then probably is a bit circular and comes back to are there values in the district that are identified as sites and areas of significance to Māori, and in my submission you should hear from Tangata Whenua about whether that is in fact the case or not, and the staff have clearly formed the view that there are, and that chapter should be included for that reason.
Ms Brand's evidence clearly states that there are Ngaito cultural values throughout the region, so based on that I would not say it's an optional chapter.
So that then comes back to the meaning of what are sites. And if sites aren't being identified, then where does that leave us?
Yeah, the heading in the standard is sites and areas of significance, so don't forget areas.
Yeah, and the area would be Gore District.
Yeah, I think...
From your body language, Mr Garbutt, is that your view as well?
Well, I think...
What are the pros and cons?
Yeah.
There's both sides.
Yeah, I think sites is something in its ordinary... I don't believe the standard goes on to further define it, is the first point that I'm not aware of, whether that's further defined in the standard. So I would fall back on the ordinary meaning of a site, or sites, it's plural. They're something that you can perhaps identify, and I don't think a site would be the whole district. Areas is much wider than sites, and could include multiple sites, and areas is not defined in any sort of way. So whether areas includes the entire district as one area, I haven't thought about that or argued about that. I think it is a matter of evidence though. If Tangata Whenua say to you there are one or two areas of significance to Tangata Whenua in the district, and this is what they are, then that's a matter of evidence, and you need to hear that and decide is the Gore District an area of significance to Māori, and can it be, are there subsets of that, or is it, as I read the evidence, that the whole site is of significance but to greater or lesser degrees, is my simple understanding of the evidence.
I look forward to the legal submissions we're going to hear on behalf of the Runanga. In my simple planner and commissioner type European view, to me the Hokanui Hills are an area. the district is the district, and if Parliament wanted us to declare the whole district an area, then it would have used that term, maybe. So I put that out there as that's the issue that we have got to come to grips with, and the more help that people are able to give us to work it through, the better.
Can I just add some kind of context here too? If you look at clause 17 in the same chapter of the planning provisions, it describes, says descriptions of the sites and areas need to be included, and then there's examples of what those might be, ranging from wahi tapu right up to cultural landscapes. And so how big is a cultural landscape? And I think that's, you know, we've used the information that the Runanga have provided, which describes the district as a single cultural landscape, I think, from memory, Courtney.
Yep, as part of the Takitimu Ranges general cultural landscape, I believe. But I'll defer to Mana Whenua on that definition.
So if I can round that out from the legal perspective, if there are sites or areas relevant to Māori in the district, then the chapter has to be in the plan. And then it's a question of what's in it, and that comes back to the merit. So from that point of view, my understanding of the evidence is there are such values, so we need the chapter, and we need to debate what's in it.
So Mana Whenua then becomes the process chapter, and the SASM then becomes the implementation chapter. And even with a process chapter, you would expect to see some objectives in terms of outcomes to be achieved.
I can comment legally. That's certainly not how it's been framed to date. You can only change what's submitted to you as a matter of scope.
I'm comfortable that there are submissions.
Yeah, okay. So yes, I don't think that the standards are prescribing exactly what must be in the Mana Whenua as opposed to the SASM chapter. So you do have a degree of latitude provided there's submissions. My submission though is significant weight should be placed on the views of Mana Whenua for the reasons I've put in my legal submissions, that we are conducting an exercise here of identifying values of significance to Mana Whenua, and what they say to you their important values are should be of significant, if not paramount, weight in the scheme of the matters that you hear, because as I alluded to in the cases, that they are consistent, that where you're trying to identify and describe values to Mana Whenua, it is their views that are very, very important. So with that caveat, yes.
Thank you, Michael. Maria, you want to continue?
Yes, so I just want to tease out thinking, putting SASM to one side again, and then coming back to the Mana Whenua chapter. When I read in the chapter that it's on page 88 of the notified version, that one of the reasons for not having objectives and policies in that chapter, aside from our discussion around the national planning standards, was that these matters have been given effect to in other chapters of the plan. And the way that's coming through from your conferencing with Ms. Beran is to have provisions that point back to MW 2.3. So if we are to reflect the intent that's written into this chapter, I imagine we need to test very carefully all the other chapters of the plan and the extent to which they are reflecting, and at the moment we seem to have a sort of a shorthand approach, which is kind of fling back to MW 2.3, point to whatever might be sitting in the objectives and policies, and you said something else before which I wrote down.
Oh,
The
and
third factor was SASM.
the SASM chapter.
And I guess I'm going to ask, is that, in your view, all that we have to do? Is there something else we should be thinking about as we tackle each chapter?
Yeah. Before I answer that, I've just quickly got a bit of a steer for us about whether or not we can have policies in the mana whenua chapter. So in the National Planning Standards, under the Tangata Whenua Mana Whenua chapter, it says the provisions under the Tangata Whenua Mana Whenua heading must only include context and process-related provisions. Other Tangata Whenua Mana Whenua provisions must be integrated throughout policy statement or plan.
Yeah, and that is what I was thinking about. Some of what is coming up is perhaps around process and implementation, and how this intent that's in this chapter and how what is being signalled for Āpiti Hono, Tātai Hono is going to flow through in practice.
Yeah, so to answer your question before I took us on a side quest, that policy wording is the only overt thing in the plan, but there are a lot of decisions and discussions that went in during the development of the plan that aren't as obvious. One of the main things being discussions around what activity status different activities had, to make sure that we were able to attach those considerations of Ngāi Tahu cultural values to relevant activities. So there are some activities that may have moved from being permitted to being permitted only under some context that would then trigger a consideration of Ngāi Tahu cultural values, or there may be some activities that may have moved to a different activity status to allow that to be attached. So there was that thought into what are the priorities and expectations and aspirations of mana whenua, and how do we reflect that in different activity statuses and different conditions on those activity statuses. And that's something that may not be as obvious to plan readers, because all a plan reader sees is that hook in different places, but a lot of discussions occurred to make sure that different activities were at an activity status level that would either allow that hook to be there or mean that that hook didn't need to be there. So that forethought has gone in throughout the entirety of the plan.
So if we were to accept that approach, then that is what we are testing as we proceed. The provisions in each chapter and how they are reflecting those aspirations of mana whenua, what's that contribution that you've just explained is what we should be paying attention to?
Yes, that's my understanding of it. There should be a reason behind why each individual activity that has a requirement to consider Ngāi Tahu cultural values has that attached to it. They weren't put there by accident. So there should be a logic flow between that specific activity, there being an understood potential risk to Ngāi Tahu cultural values, based on that activity or the way that activity plays out, and therefore that hook is attached to it. So it flows through in that way.
Probably another thing to clarify is that you'll get some more of this in the hearings to come. So, for example, residential, multi-purpose zone, potentially industrial, may also have reference back to the Mana Whenua chapter in terms of matters of discretion. And you'll see in Ms Bennett's evidence, she's also picked up the discussion from hearing stream 2 as well. So because of the way the hearings are structured, you're not getting it all at once, you're going to get it as the hearings progress.
So this question I think I will leave till the SESM, because some of what was happening here was obviously some activity generated around discussion of SESM, and you know, some stuff we might actually want to park until that later hearing. So I'm just going to weed out some of my queries on that basis. So at your para 22 of your original evidence in chief, I wanted to ask you, part of our job is to ensure that the iwi management plan is taken into account in our decision making. And so I'm interested to understand how the content of Te Tangi a Tauira relates to this chapter and the whole of the plan. Understanding that there are two key tools that you've highlighted and that have come from Hokonui direction, and that's Te Kawa o Te Taio and Apiti Hono Tātai Hono. And you've highlighted that in both cases they don't hit the threshold for having Te Runanga o Ngāi Tahu sign off as an iwi management plan. So in order for us to fulfil that aspect of our job, I'm just looking for a bit of guidance from you in relation to the development of the chapter and the plan.
Yeah, sure. So as discussed in my section 42A, all of these documents have been used, but they've been used to my understanding of where they are most sensible to be used. So the iwi management plan, as has been discussed, is a mandated document, and that triggers some requirements under the RMA. So that document has been used to inform policy in the chapters that have objectives, policies and rules. The content of Te Kawa o Te Taio talks more about Hokonui Runanga aspirations and values as opposed to policy directions. So that information has been pulled across into this chapter so that they are consistent with each other. Te Kawa o Te Taio, from my understanding, doesn't direct policy. It explains values. It's more of an explanatory document, and because the Mana Whenua chapter is more of an explanatory section, those two sit nicely together. Te Kawa o Te Taio hasn't been used to inform policy in the other chapters because the document itself doesn't include policy direction. Apiti Hono Tātai Hono has been used where Mana Whenua requested it be used to inform the methodology approach. And that's how they sit differently. So we couldn't use Te Kawa o Te Taio to direct policy, one, because it's not mandated to, and two, because it doesn't have any policy direction in it. So even if it was mandated, we couldn't use it in that way.
So as we are going through and looking at chapters, we can be guided by the relationship between Te Tangi a Tauira and objectives and policies. And Te Kawa o Te Taio, I could see, had contributed a lot of content to this chapter, and that's its good purpose.
Yep.
And you just described Apiti Hono Tātai Hono as methodology, so it's more about the implementation end of the plan?
The stage one Ngaitoki Murihaku cultural values study, which is where the Apati Ono Tātai Hono methodology was introduced. That document introduces Apati Ono Tātai Hono. It was the desire of mana whenua to use that methodology to assess Ngāi Tahu cultural values in the context of the district plan. So that's the relationship there. We haven't used anything from that study to inform policy. It's just that has provided us with a methodology that we can then use, well, that mana whenua can use when they deem it appropriate. But all of the policy relationship is with the iwi management plan as it should be. Apati Ono o Tātai Hono sits outside of that as a methodology that mana whenua can use when they consider it appropriate. It doesn't inform policy itself.
Okay, that's one of my key questions that I wanted to ask you, based on your experience and development of the plan, and seeing the timing of those Apati Hono Tātai Hono assessments that are attached to Ms. Beerin's evidence. And what struck me when I read those was, while they're discrete parts of the district that are being assessed, as opposed to the whole, it is information that is already available, and in reading them, at the end there are some really clear recommendations in relation to each area that has been assessed. So I had wondered to what extent those recommendations had fed their way into the provisions in the plan. So that's part one of my question, so I'll stop there before I go on to the next part.
Yep.
Yeah.
So those ones were the ones for the industrial areas, is that? Okay, cool. So from my understanding of that work program, those assessments were undertaken to support council to identify appropriate locations for industrial zoning. So those recommendations from those assessments then helped with that decision making about where different industrial zones could go.
And so there was that zoning decision. I can see how they would have informed that. At the same time, though, the specific recommendations look to me to be, what you might be seeking to manage in once the zone has been identified. And so I'm curious around to what extent those recommendations sort of carry through and are reflected in the way the zones and the zone provisions work. And my reason for asking this question is because we've got the approach being suggested of further work and a variation to come, informed by Apati Hono Tātai Hono, and I presume the recommendations that would fall out of that assessment. Understanding that such a process might take time, but we are in a process at the moment, and we should be using, I think, the best available information that we've got to make this product coming out of the end of this process as strong as we can make it.
Absolutely.
And so I look at those 6 assessments that have been done, and I have that hanging question: to what extent can these be informing us now in our provisions that takes some of the questions around certainty away in certain areas, and where we've got an opportunity to do that, I think we've got a responsibility to. So I guess I don't know that that's so much a question. I think it's a question maybe for when we're looking at individual chapters and where those recommendations are relevant. And it seemed to me that some of them might be relevant just for the industrial zone, but perhaps in other ways as well. One thing I noticed, and this is something I can discuss with Hokonui and Ms. Beirin when we come there, is, for instance, there's a couple of the assessments pointing towards low impact design for stormwater. That's something that came up in hearing stream 1 in relation to provisions there. It was a signal to me that there's stuff sitting here in the assessments already done that perhaps we should be paying attention to. And then my question would be, how do we do that as we go through this process, and what's the appropriate way to handle that?
Can I just provide a bit more guidance? It's partly a question too, Courtney, because I think from memory those assessments did identify particular values that need to be considered. So I think in hearing stream 2 we had a discussion about controls around building heights and where they were visible from and that sort of thing. You're right about water quality, and we did have that discussion in hearing stream 1 about where low impact design is referenced across the plan, and some of that does stem from the Apatihano assessments, because those requirements do play out in the industrial zones. So my understanding is those assessments did also guide provisions beyond just the zoning, but how things are going to be managed within those zones, and it provided guidance for how we need to look at other zones and where those hooks might be applied across other zones too.
Yeah, from memory, some of that content also informed things like setbacks and screening and things like that as well. I do think it's important to stress that those assessments were done for a specific purpose, and we can't assume that those recommendations can apply across a range of different contexts, because specific questions were being asked. For clarity, I was involved in a previous role in doing those assessments and just drawing on that experience without speaking on behalf of anybody else, just drawing on that experience. We were answering very specific questions, and I think that's important to keep in mind as well.
From your viewpoint, there was a consistency that came across all 4 assessments on several points, and one of them was the protection of views of the Hokanuis. How would you envisage that being achieved?
Through maximum height standards.
Okay, so that doesn't help me to the extent of from where are the viewpoints being taken? Are we talking about viewpoints from private land or from public land? So if the intent is to protect views of the Hokanuis, from where?
That's a question for mana whenua and their interpretation of their cultural values.
But as an advisor to council, what's your expectation of how that will be done in the plan? Is there a need for an assessment to be done of critical view shafts, for example? When I think of the Auckland plan, the volcanic cones are seen as significant features, and you look up the plan and there's some key viewing points, Dominion Road, whatever, that has a view shaft, and there's height controls that apply in that. So blanket height controls across a zone or whatever, are they going to achieve the outcome of protecting views, and from where?
I'm familiar with the Auckland plan, so I absolutely get what you're talking about. The way that the plan is currently drafted allows some flexibility around that matter. So it allows for, if a consideration around those views are triggered within the plan, it allows a discussion to happen with mana whenua, for them to advise whether or not it is relevant on a case-by-case basis. From my perspective, that's a more flexible and pragmatic approach than doing a whole view shaft assessment piece of work and then making it, there not be able to be any flexibility there.
So that would then require all, well, it can only apply for where there's a resource consent,
Yes,
isn't it?
correct.
So that would then require all resource consents to go to the Runanga?
Only those in which that is a matter that's triggered under the rules as drafted.
So, and that's, I guess, picking up on where Maria has been heading in terms of the discretion that is provided in the rules. Is the guidance of just referring to section 2.3 sufficient to actually indicate a trigger has been reached where written approval or feedback should be obtained?
My view is that, bearing in mind the amendments that have been agreed between myself and Ms. Barron, that there is a level of direction there it's at a level where it provides appropriate guidance to decision makers. Through the amendments discussed between Ms. Barron and I, there is a heightened level of guidance there now than there was in the proposed plan.
Can you give us an example, please?
All of the examples are in my section 42A and my supplementary evidence. I'll see if I can pull a specific one up for you.
One up from the supplementary, just for context.
Sure.
Because it does give rise to, I guess under section 32AA, the practicality of the level of consultation, etc. Because I'm aware that there have been cases where it's taken some time to get a response out of the Runanga. So from an implementation point of view, is that something, I guess, from Matt that we need to have regard to as well?
So I've got one example here, which is TCZ P3. Originally in this policy, it only discussed that provide for a built development in the neighbourhood centre that responds to the underlying relationship Ngāi Tahu hold with the natural environment. Very broad. What has been agreed is that that has been removed and replaced with has appropriate setbacks to waterways to maintain and enhance their amenity, ecological values, maintain access for mahinga kai practices and reduce effects on Māori Kūtiki systems. So that's creating a more limited but specific level of things to discuss at that point. So a decision maker could look through that and think, is this impacting access to mahinga kai practices? Is it reducing effects on Māori? Is it reducing effects on Kūtiki systems, which creates specific questions to ask instead of the broader question of, does this respond to the underlying relationship?
So the systems referred to there, what are they?
Kūtiki systems?
Yeah.
So those are discussed in Mana Whenua 2.3. From my understanding, which is better elaborated on by Mana Whenua, my understanding is Kūtiki systems are about the holistic relationships between all different parts of the environment. similar in some ways, but not always, to catchment level management of issues.
So is the processing planner going to have sufficient understanding to make a reasonable judgment as to whether that requires consultation with the Runanga?
I believe so.
Keith, I've got a question for you. Would you like to clarify just that question you just asked? Or should we discuss it later?
Well, I think we need to be open from the point of view, and I'm happy to discuss it in the meeting here, that you can have a provision in the policy, but I'm thinking at it from the point of view of the planner who's processing a consent. Are they actually going to be able to reach a judgment on the basis of what is in the plan as to whether the Hokonui Runanga are an affected party? Previously there have been an agreement between the council and the Runanga that consents on particular issues would be referred to them. With the preparation of a new plan, there's a new approach that's required, and how practical and fair and reasonable from the point of view of an applicant are the provisions in terms of giving guidance to the processing planner.
I can probably add some context to that. Good morning, panel. Because I'm involved in processing resource consents here at Gore District Council. As the plan currently sits, and I guess our current sort of way of approaching these things is, as Courtney mentioned, there's been charters around sort of the framework and processes and resourcing, and a lot of what we do is based on the relationship that we have with the Hokonui Runanga, which has very much been a case of sort of open communication. We can pick up the phone, we can discuss things. So in terms of having terms in the plan and how a processing planner may implement them or understand them, I think it's really important to focus on that ongoing relationship that the council has with the Hokonui Runanga, and how it's a two-way relationship of communication and understanding. I think also that is reflected in the community. In practice, applications that come in, we have had sort of a list of, I guess, kind of aspects that would then cause us to turn our minds to whether or not there is a cultural effect, and those things usually relate to earthworks in proximities of waterways, subdivisions of land that could contain a significant waterway, also obviously our statutory acknowledgement areas. So there's a good understanding I consider in the district of those types of applications, and therefore what you then need to do as part of your consultation in preparing your resource consent. And I would say more often than not, when applications come to us and are lodged, they have already had prior consultation with Hokonui Runanga and either have comment from them or in the process of obtaining that affected party approval. So I consider that with the new plan going forward, and actually the detail that is in the Mana Whenua chapter is only going to make that easier and better, in my opinion. Based on what we've got in the plan now and how things are working, I consider that the Mana Whenua chapter actually has a lot more to offer in terms of providing clarity and guidance for both decision makers and applicants, and also that relationship with the Hokonui Runanga will continue, and in terms of implementing the plan.
Thank you, very helpful.
I still want some more clarity, both from Joe and Courtney, in response to your answer. Courtney, you may wish to answer first. You don't see Hokanui Runanga being an affected party in every instance or every consent process?
No, I don't.
Right, that could potentially be a concern if that was the case. So how do we articulate that, bearing in mind that Runanga sees the whole of the district as a site and of cultural landscape and of significance? How do we balance those two things?
That's something that we put a lot of thought into when we were drafting the plan, and a lot of that is reflected in the activity statuses. So there were conversations had with a wide range of mana whenua affiliated planning practitioners in Murihuku to understand the types of consents that often have impact on cultural values, and we use that information to decide which activities we should attach those hooks about consideration of Ngāi Tahu cultural values to. So there's a wide range of activities that haven't historically, based on the advice that was received, typically have impact on those values. There's also a number that very commonly do, like it's been discussed, earthworks, activities around rivers, things like that. So that is where we attached those hooks. So yes, based on the evidence that's been provided by Hokanui Runanga and the understanding through the drafting of the plan, there is a relationship throughout the whole district. But as has been said in Ms Brand's evidence and Ms Sinickel's evidence, just because there's a relationship, that doesn't mean that development cannot happen. So there's been careful thought into what types of activities typically create issues, and that's where those hooks have been put.
So I think you just answered my next question, which was
Brilliant.
Associated with your paragraph 28 of your evidence in chief, where you are highlighting high-risk activities, is what you've described them as. So you've just expanded on that now. And my reason for sort of honing in on this is because some of the textual changes coming through in recommendations are using the phrase, I'm just going to pull it up because I found it before. No, I've lost it again. Where are you? So in this case, it's in your supplementary evidence actually, where you've had to and fro with Ms Beran around the general rural GRUS P13. So it's paragraph 98 that I'm looking at now of the supplementary from Ms Bennett, and it's discussion of the general rural zone policy 13. And this wording that pops up, not just here, but in other circumstances where...
Sorry, paragraph 98 of my supplementary evidence.
Yes.
I think that's my evidence. Sorry.
Is it? Sorry, what am I looking at?
Yeah, so Courtney had...
right, it is too, sorry.
Only because it sort of overlaps with the rural topics, so I've covered off those policies that are specific to the
Sorry,
rural
when
zones.
I asked for the supplementary evidence before, obviously pulled up.
I'm happy to answer it though.
Okay, so it does relate to this idea of the high-risk activities, I think. But there is this phrasing that's been coming through in different solutions, wording solutions, that says, now I've lost it again, something about significant, nearly there, people. Here we are. Activity has a significant effect on cultural values. So what I was concerned with was, where does this test of significance come from? Because I look at section 6E, it's got no threshold.
Yep.
And it's about that relationship. And so I can see, say, section 6F with its appropriateness test, which is why I'm thinking a little bit differently about section 6F to section 6E. And when I look at section 6E, it's got no qualifiers.
I agree.
And there isn't a significance threshold in there. So, so I'm going to allow you to answer now, thinking about the conversation that we just had around high-risk activities. How do we understand the rationale for putting a significance threshold or test in? I mean, this example's come through Ms. Skewes' evidence, but it's popping up in different offered wordings. So can you give your thoughts on that?
My initial thought on that is that it would be the role of mana whenua to advise whether it's significant or not, because they're the only ones that can talk about their own values. And as Ms. Skewes has talked about, there's that relationship there where a conversation can be had to discuss matters like that. From my understanding, it doesn't have to be a formalised process as such. It can be a phone call to say, is this something that concerns you? If the answer's yes, you go into a more formal process. If the answer's no, well then that's that. Is that how things have been working typically?
Yes, typically, yeah.
And so this is actually a function, this idea of the significance test is actually a function of mana whenua expressing their relationship with the district.
That's how I understand it with the information I have, yes.
Courtney, you've just suggested a more informal approach to fleshing out areas of potential concern. That's a wee bit of a dilemma for when you construct a plan. How would you suggest we acknowledge that, or obviously outside the plan, the district and the district council want to enhance and continue to have a dialogue and a close relationship with the Runanga, but it doesn't really fit within the plan? Or do you have a suggestion there?
That's something I would expect to be covered in a Charter of Understanding or a service level agreement on that kind of documentation, which, as you correctly say, sits outside of a plan. But I agree that it's something that does need to be documented in some way, shape or form, and I think there are lots of examples around the country of that kind of documentation, and even examples already here through the relationship agreements that the council already has with the Runanga.
I would hope the council also prepares some brochures to give guidance to applicants jointly. So while the memorandum of understanding is between the Runanga and council, I think it's highly desirable that there is actually something in guidance to applicants.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Any more questions, Maria?
Yes, bear with me, I do have some more. So
That's what we're here for.
yeah, at your paragraph 45 of your evidence in chief, I wanted to ask about effects on Ngāi Tahu values that may be positive or negative. So something that I was picking up, say when I was reading Ms. Murchison's evidence, there was very much this angle of adverse effects on and the extent, which we've just been discussing, whether it's significant or not. But of course, effects can be both positive and negative. And when I was reading the Āpiti Honol Tātou Honol assessments, there's elements in there, say, pointing to restorative actions, that kind of thing. And I could see that those are the kind of actions that perhaps might fall into the positive camp. So how are the plan provisions addressing not just the negative impacts, but the kind of constructive, perhaps, elements of relationship.
Yep, so the wording that is often being used throughout the policy to talk about impacts on Ngāi Tahu cultural values being impacts on Ngāi Tahu cultural values as identified in Manawhene 2.3 and the Opson Polls and the SASM chapter, that wording doesn't imply positive or negative. It talks about impacts in the neutral. My understanding of how that could be used is if you need to consider the impacts of those values on those values. If those impacts are positive, well, then that would support a decision maker to approve that kind of activity. So the wording as drafted was intentionally neutral to allow for both positive and negative to be considered and it to push it in either direction depending on which of those it is. Because I completely agree, sometimes activities do have positive, well, from my understanding, some activities can have the potential to have positive impacts as well as negative. And I think it's important to have an avenue to consider both of those.
Kia ora. That's helpful. So I think we've covered that.
How many more questions have we got? Because it's only like 2 or 3.
I have yet to start talking to you about the provisions that are actually in the chapter. I'd really appreciate if we could, Mr Chair, have a 10-minute break for several reasons.
Amazing.
Right, we'll adjourn for 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Thank you.